The Helena livestock market smelled of wet straw and sweat and old leather that morning, and the widow walking through the gate did not look up at any man, because if she looked up, she would not be able to do what she had come to do. Her name was Hannah Mendelson, 34 years old, dressed in mourning black gone gray at the cuffs, and the rope in her right hand was tied around the neck of a soft-tied Jersey cow named Pearl, the last asset her family owned. Behind her walked two children, Sarah, 11, and little Eli, 7, his small hand swallowed in his sister's grip. The auctioneer climbed the block, cleared his throat, and called Pearl a decent dairy, ma'am, decent enough. Bidders muttered. $8. 10. Hannah's eyes burned, and the starting bid was already below what the tax man wanted, and she stood very, very still, because if she moved, she would break. Now to understand how a woman ends up at that gate with the last living thing she owns on a rope, you have to go back 14 months, back to a February evening in the foothills, when a wind came down off the big belts, and a man named Jacob Mendelson coughed once into his sleeve and did not stop coughing for 9 days. Pneumonia, the country doctor said on the 10th morning. There was nothing to be done. Jacob held Hannah's hand and asked her, in that calm, low voice he'd always used when something terrible was coming, to keep the children fed and the fence standing. Then he closed his eyes, and the cabin went very quiet, and Hannah Mendelson became a widow at 33 with 4 acres, one rough log house, one leaning chicken coop, and one milk cow named Pearl. She did not cry that first night. Grief in her family had always come slow, the way snow melts, not the way ice cracks. What she did instead, the morning after the burial, was lace up her husband's old boots over her own thin shoes and walk out to the barn and milk Pearl. 2 gallons. She strained, skimmed, churned. She fed the chickens. She split kindling. She sat the children down at the table that evening and told them, in a voice that did not shake, that they were going to be all right, that the 4 acres were paid for, that Pearl gave good milk, and that come spring she would plant potatoes and beans, and they would have enough. And for 14 long, lean months, they had enough. Barely. Sarah learned to skim cream, the way most girls learn to braid hair. Eli learned to gather eggs without breaking a single shell. Hannah took in mending from the Helena dressmakers at 2 cents a seam and sewed by lamplight until her shoulders went numb. She traded butter for flour and salt. She sold eggs to the railway boarding house. She did not buy a single new thing, not a ribbon, not a needle, not a sweet for the children in all that time. And still, friends, there is a thing called the territorial tax bill, and it does not care that your husband is dead. That May of 1891, it came written in black ink on a folded sheet. The courthouse clerk himself rode out to deliver, because some clerks do not trust the mail with bad news. $22 due by May the 30th. $22, or the land goes to auction. Hannah read the bill twice. She walked out to the barn, put her forehead against Pearl's warm flank, and did the arithmetic every homesteader does at least once in their life. Butter money, egg money, mending money, 3 silver dollars in the coffee tin, 4 pennies under the lamp. And then she counted Pearl. The cow was worth maybe $15 on a good day. 18 if a dairyman was buying. She would sell Pearl, she decided. After that, well, after that she would figure out how to feed 2 children without a milk cow. One thing at a time. So that is how the widow came to be standing at the gate of the Helena livestock market on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May, with Pearl's rope soft and damp in her right hand, and her 2 children quiet as church mice behind her. That is how the auctioneer came to be calling out a starting bid of $8 on the last living asset of the Mendelson family. And that is when the bidding stalled. It stalled at $11. 11. The auctioneer, a Helena man named Briggs who had known Jacob by sight, looked across the muddy yard at the widow and stretched the bid as long as he could. 11, I hear 11, do I hear 12, $12 for a sound jersey, gentle as a lamb, near 3 gallons a day. But there was no 12. The dairymen had spent their money on the Henderson herd. The teamsters didn't want a milker. The butcher had a Hereford coming in on the afternoon train. $11. Going once. Hannah felt the heat climb her throat. $11 and 3 coppers in a tin, and the tax bill was 22. She had failed her husband. She had failed the fence. Going twice. Sarah made a small sound, and Eli's hand tightened in his sister's. The auctioneer's hammer lifted. And from the back of the yard, from somewhere near the chestnut hitching post where the older men stood and watched and rarely bid, a voice came. A low voice, not loud, not theatrical, just clear enough to carry across the yard the way a rifle shot carries across a still field. 25. The market went quiet. Briggs froze with his hammer in the air. The dairymen turned. The teamsters turned. Even the cow turned, because cows know when a voice means something. 25 was more than market. 25 was more than Pearl had ever been worth on the best day of her best year. Hannah's head came up slowly, the way a deer's head comes up at the snap of a twig, and her eyes found the man at the back. He was tall, lean, weather-burned, with a beard the color of old iron and a hat brim pulled low. Buckskin coat. Heavy boots. A long-bladed knife at his hip. Hannah knew him at once. Thaddeus Carter. Thad. Trapper Smith, 56 years old, lived 3 valleys over, rode into Helena every spring with a wagon full of pelts. His late wife had been Mary Carter, the woman who, the first year Hannah came west as a bride of 19, had spent 4 cold afternoons teaching her how to sew a proper double-felled seam. Hannah had not seen Thad up close in 10 years. She had heard he'd lost Mary to a fever in '88. She had sent a sympathy card with 3 pressed columbines folded inside it, and thought she would never see the man again. And now he was bidding $25 on her cow. The other bidders dropped out, quietly, the way men drop out when they understand they are watching something that has stopped being an auction. Briggs lowered his hammer with a soft, almost embarrassed tap. "Sold," he said, "to Mr. Carter for $25 cash." Thad walked up through the yard, counted out $25 in silver and small gold from a worn leather pouch, counted it slow so Hannah could see every coin, and laid it on the block. Then he turned and walked to Hannah. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply held out his open hand for the rope. Hannah looked at his hand. She looked at Pearl. She looked at Sarah, whose eyes were brimming. And then she put the rope in Thad Carter's palm. He closed his fingers around it, touched his hat brim, and said, in that low, clear voice, "Ma'am." "Thank you kindly," that was all. Sarah's tears spilled silent down her cheeks. Eli pressed his face into his mother's hip. Thad led Pearl out of the yard, down the muddy main street of Helena, and around the corner of the feed store, and he was gone. Now you'd think, friends, that this is where the story turns. You'd think the mountain man walks the cow around the corner and walks her right back, with a flourish and a doffed hat and a speech. But that is not how Thaddeus Carter did things. Thad gave gifts the way a glacier gives a valley, slowly, deliberately, only when the ground was ready. And so what happened next was nothing. Hannah stood in the empty yard with 25 silver dollars heavy in her apron pocket, took her children by the hand, and walked 4 blocks to the courthouse, where she laid 22 of those dollars on the clerk's oak counter and watched him stamp her tax bill paid in blue ink. $3 left. $3 for the rest of the year. She walked out into the May sunshine and felt neither triumph nor grief, only the strange flat numbness of a woman who has just sold the last warm thing in her life. They walked home the long way, 6 miles into the foothills, and did not talk. At supper Hannah peeled the last 6 potatoes from the cellar, salted them with the last salt, and the three of them ate by lamplight and went to bed early, because there was no cream to skim and nothing, suddenly, to do in the long, quiet hours before sleep. 3 slow, strange, milkless days passed. Hannah moved through them like a woman in a dream. She fed the chickens. She mended a shirt. She stared at the empty stanchion and could not look at it for long. On the morning of the 4th day, Hannah heard the rattle of a heavy wagon coming up the rutted lane, chains jingling, axles creaking, the plodding step of draft horses, and behind that, the lighter step of cattle on lead. She set down her broom. She opened the door. It was Thad Carter. He sat up on the bench of a long flatbed wagon, reins easy in his hands, hat brim tipped against the morning sun. And behind the wagon, on a long single-lead rope, walked Pearl, Hannah's Pearl, soft-eyed and unhurried, and walking alongside her, 3 other animals. A young black bull, broad in the chest. 2 red and white heifers, both deep in the flank, both. Hannah saw at once with a stockwoman's eye, bred, both within a month or 2 of calving. In a slatted crate, 6 fat Rhode Island red hens. Behind the hens, a winter's worth of feed, oats, corn, a bale of good prairie hay. A bright new tin milk pail with a wooden handle. And taking up the whole rear of the wagon bed, tied down and wrapped in oilcloth, a great heavy wooden crate stenciled in black letters down one side, Singer Manufacturing Company, New York. A brand new treadle sewing machine. Hannah's hand went to her throat. She could not speak. Sarah came up behind her in the doorway and made a small sound that was half wonder and half fear. Eli pushed between them and stared. Thad climbed down slowly, the way a man with a stiff knee climbs down, and untied the lead rope of the small herd. Pearl raised her head at the smell of her old pasture and lowed once, a long soft note that brought tears to Sarah's eyes for the second time in 4 days. Thad walked the 4 cattle into the small pasture beside the barn and latched the gate. He set the crate of hens inside the chicken yard. He carried the feed sacks one by one into the lean-to and stacked them neat. He hung the new milk pail on the nail beside the stanchion, where the old dented one had hung for 14 months. He did all this slowly, methodically, the way a man does work he has thought about for a long time. Hannah stood in the doorway and did not move. Nobody spoke. When Thad was finished, he came back to the wagon and stood beside it. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him, the way men do at funerals and weddings. He looked at Hannah, and for the first time, friends, for the first time in 14 months, Hannah saw a man's eyes that did not pity her, only saw her. "Ma'am," he said, quiet as before, "I bought your cow. I'm returning her. With friends. The bull's young, but he's sound. He'll throw good calves for 10 years. The heifers are bred to a Hereford up in the Smith Valley. They'll drop in June. The hens are layers, 2 years old, the best brown egg layers in the county. The feed'll see you through to first cutting. The pail's new because the old one's old. And the machine," he gestured back at the great oilcloth-wrapped crate, "the machine's because my late wife once said your hands were the only ones in this territory she'd trust her quilts to. And she left a will, ma'am. I'm still honoring it." That was the whole speech. He put his hat back on. He climbed up onto the wagon bench. He picked up the reins. Hannah found her voice then, the way a person finds a voice in a dream late and from very far away. She said, "Mr. Carter, I can't. I can't accept. This is more than I can't." Thad Carter did not argue with her. He did not press. He did not even look distressed. He looked, if anything, gentle and a little tired. He nodded once, the smallest nod, and he said only, "Ma'am, you don't have to accept it today. You can leave the gate open and let 'em wander off, if that's what your pride tells you." But Mary asked and I promised. The promise is done either way. "Good day to you, ma'am." "Good day, Miss Sarah." "Good day, young Eli," He clicked his tongue. The draft horses leaned into their collars. The empty wagon creaked. And Thaddeus Carter rode out of the Mendelsohn yard the same way he'd come in, slow, easy, and without looking back. Hannah stood in the doorway for a long while after the wagon was gone. The pasture, which only an hour before had held nothing but flattened grass and the ghost of a cow, now held 4 good head of cattle grazing quietly in the morning sun. The chicken yard, which had held 3 thin layers, now held 9. And in the bed of the world, somewhere just behind her ribs, something that had been clenched tight for 14 months had begun, very slowly, to loosen. She did not know yet whether the loosening was a good thing or a dangerous thing. She walked out into the yard. She lifted the new milk pail off the nail. She looked at it a long moment. And then she saw, that there was something tucked underneath the pail on the nail itself. A folded sheet of paper, sealed with a small dab of red wax. Her name written on the outside in a steady, old-fashioned hand. Hannah Mendelsohn. She did not open it then. She could not. She put the letter inside her apron pocket, and she went back into the cabin, and she did the only thing she knew how to do. She worked. She milked Pearl, who gave nearly 3 gallons and stood patient as if she'd never left. She gathered eggs, 11 of them from 9 hens, on the very first morning. She fed the bull and the heifers. She came inside. She made a supper of fresh eggs and fresh butter and fresh milk, the first such supper in those walls in 4 days, and the children ate without speaking, and Eli, halfway through his second egg, put down his spoon and said in a small, clear voice, "Mama, are we allowed to be happy?" And Hannah Mendelsohn, who had not cried at her husband's burial, who had not cried at the tax bill, who had not cried even when the auctioneer's hammer lifted, Hannah Mendelsohn put her face down into her hands at the supper table and wept for 1 solid hour while her 2 children sat very still on either side of her and did not move. When she could see again, she lit the lamp, and she took the letter out of her apron pocket, and she broke the small red seal. It was not from Thad. The hand was different, finer, slanted, a woman's. The date at the top was March the 11th, 1888. 3 years and 2 months ago. The letter began, "My dear husband Thaddeus." Hannah's hands began to shake before she had read 3 lines. Mary Carter, dying of the fever in her own bed 3 valleys over, in a winter when Hannah had not even known the woman was sick. Mary Carter had sat up against her pillows and dictated this letter, and Thad had written it down, and Mary had signed it at the bottom in a hand grown thin and wandering. The letter was a kind of will. Not a legal will, Thad had handled the legal will with the Helena lawyer, but a will of the heart, a list of things Mary wanted done after she was gone. There were 3 things on the list. The first was a request that Thad keep her mother's china teapot for as long as he lived. The second was a request that he visit her sister in St. Paul at least once before he died. And the third was a long, careful paragraph, written slow because Mary had been tired, that read in part. There is a small inheritance of mine in the Helena Bank from my father's estate, $192 and some odd cents, that I have never touched and have never told you about because I was saving it for a purpose. The purpose is this. There is a young woman in the foothills, Hannah Mendelsohn, married to that good Jacob who keeps the 4 acres past the second creek. I taught her to sew her first year out here, Thaddeus, and her hands are the best young hands I have ever seen on a needle. She has the gift, husband. She does not know it. She thinks she is only a farm wife. But if anything ever happens to her, if she is ever in trouble, if she is ever in need, if she is ever standing in a market with nothing left to sell, you are to take this money, and you are to find a way, the most graceful and least proud-wounding way you can find, to put her back on her feet. Buy her cattle if cattle is what she needs. Buy her seed. Buy her a Singer machine, husband, a good one with a treadle, because a woman with hands like hers should not be sewing by hand in lamplight when there are machines in the world. Help her without breaking her pride. Promise me, Thaddeus. The letter was signed in that thin wandering hand, your loving wife, Mary Ann Carter. Hannah read the letter once. She read it twice. She read it a third time, her finger tracing under the line about her hands. And then she laid the letter down very carefully on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with both palms, and sat in the lamplight, and cried again. Softer this time, longer, the kind of crying that a person does when grief and gratitude come into the same room at the same time and shake hands. The next Sunday morning, Hannah Mendelsohn did something she had not done in 14 months. She put on her good dress, the dark blue wool with the small pearl buttons that Jacob had bought her the Christmas before he died, and she dressed the children in their good clothes, and she hitched the old buckboard to the heifer that was furthest from calving, and she drove the 6 miles into Helena for church. She had not been to church since the burial. She had not been able to bear it. But this Sunday she went, and in the back of the buckboard, wrapped in clean linen, she carried a quilt. The quilt was a thing she had been making in secret off and on by lamplight for nearly 4 years. After Mary Carter's funeral in '88, the Helena dressmakers had gathered up the old work dresses from Mary's wardrobe, the ones the family did not want, and they had sent them out to the foothill seamstresses to be cut down for rag. Hannah had been given a bundle of 6 of those dresses, faded blues and a soft green and a small flowered print, and she had not been able to bring herself to cut them down for rag. Instead, she had cut them into quilt pieces, careful, slow, 2 pieces a week some weeks, no pieces other weeks, and she had stitched them together, by hand in the long evenings after Jacob died, into a double-bed quilt with a Star of Bethlehem at the center. She had told no one. She had not even told Sarah. She had been planning for nearly 4 years to bring it to Thaddeus Carter someday, to give it back to him, but she had never had the courage, because the gift seemed too small, or too strange, or too forward, or too sad. The Singer machine, friends, the Singer machine had given her the courage. She walked into the Helena church with the quilt over her arms and Sarah and Eli on either side of her, and she walked, in the hush of the gathering congregation, straight up the center aisle. Thad Carter was in the 3rd pew on the right, where he always sat, hat on the bench beside him, big rough hands folded in his lap. He looked up. The congregation went quiet, the way congregations do when something they don't quite understand begins to happen. Hannah stopped at the end of his pew. She unfolded the quilt, Mary's faded blues, Mary's soft green, Mary's small flowered print, all stitched into a great 8-pointed star, and she laid it across Thad's knees. She said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Mr. Carter, your wife gave me my hands. I made this with hers. I should have brought it to you 4 years ago. I'm sorry I waited," that was all she said. Thad Carter, the lean, weather-burned trappersmith of 56, who had ridden into a market and bid $25 on a cow without raising his voice, who had loaded a wagon with cattle and a Singer machine without ceremony. Thad Carter looked down at the quilt across his knees and saw his late wife's blue work dress, the one she'd worn the spring she planted the wild plum tree. He saw her soft green Sunday dress. He saw the small flowered print she'd been buried in a memory of. He put one big rough hand flat against the center star. His shoulders began to shake. And the trapper, the smith, the mountain man who had not wept in public since the burial in '88, Thaddeus Carter, put his face in both hands in the 3rd pew of the Helena church and wept like a child. Hannah stood at the end of the pew. She did not touch him. She did not say another word. There was nothing romantic in that moment, friends, nothing of the kind some folks might imagine. There were only 2 people, a widow and a widower, standing in the hush of a country church, honoring one woman's last wish. The minister, who had been about to begin the opening hymn, set down his book. The congregation stood, one by one, without being told. And in the warm, dustlit silence of that Helena Sunday, a debt that had been written in a sickbed 3 years before was, at last made even. 2 summers passed. If you rode out today, 6 miles up the wagon road into the foothills, and reined in on the rise above the Mendelssohn place, you would not recognize it. The 4 acres are still 4 acres, the cabin still the same rough log cabin, but the pasture is full, friends, the pasture is full. 14 head of cattle graze where 1 cow once stood. The chicken yard holds 30 laying hens and a rooster with a bad temper. There is a small dairy shed behind the barn now, whitewashed, with 3 milk cans on a shelf and a sign above the door that reads MENDELSON Butter, Foothill Creamery, in Sarah's careful hand. Sarah is 13 now, tall and serious, riding into Helena 3 afternoons a week with the midwife Mrs. Halloran. She has caught her first baby already, a boy born to a brakeman's wife, and Mrs. Halloran says the girl has the steadiest hands the territory has seen in 30 years. Eli is 9, and Eli rides out every Saturday morning to Thad's forge, where he is learning to heat iron and swing a small hammer, and he comes home Sunday evening smelling of coal smoke, pleased with himself, with a horseshoe nail he made with his own hands in his pocket. Thad Carter remarried in the spring of the 2nd year. He courted slowly and properly a Helena schoolteacher named Rebecca Lindholm, a widow herself, 2 children of her own grown and gone east, a woman with a quiet laugh and a fondness for wildflowers. They were married in the same Helena church on a June Sunday, and Hannah Mendelssohn stood in the second pew on the left and clapped until her hands hurt. Rebecca and Hannah became, almost at once, the kind of friends that frontier women become when the country has tried them and not broken them, close, plain-spoken, useful to each other. Rebecca rides up the foothills every Thursday with a basket of new books for Sarah and Eli. Hannah rides 3 valleys over every other Saturday with a crock of butter and a bundle of mending. Thad cleared a small wagon trail between the 2 homesteads in the autumn of that 2nd year, working alone with an axe and a mule for 6 weeks, and the trail is called in that country to this day the Carter-Mendelssohn Cut. And if you walked on a quiet evening out behind the Mendelssohn barn, you would find the small pen where Pearl was kept the night before the auction, the same plank fence, the same low gate, the same worn smooth post where the rope was tied. It is full now. Always full. Pearl is old, 11 years old this spring, and she does not give 3 gallons anymore, but she gives a steady 1.5 gallons, and her granddaughter, a soft-eyed Jersey heifer named Star, is being trained alongside her, and Sarah milks them both every morning before school. In the front room of the cabin, beside the lamp where Hannah used to sew until her shoulders went numb, stands a black and gold Singer treadle machine on a polished oak stand. Hannah sews on it almost every evening. She has begun to take orders, friends, real orders from the Helena dressmakers and from 2 shops as far away as Butte. She made 9 quilts last winter and sold every one. She is putting away, in a coffee tin behind the flour barrel, money for Sarah's midwife schooling in St. Paul. She is putting away, in a second tin, money for Eli's apprenticeship papers. She is putting away in a third tin the small annual property tax, which she pays in early April now in cash, 6 weeks before it's due. On the wall above the Singer, framed in plain pine, is the letter. Mary Carter's letter. Hannah had it framed in Helena the summer of the 2nd year, glass over the front, the small red seal still intact on the lower corner. Sarah dusts it every Saturday. Eli, when he is home, sometimes stands in front of it for a long time, his hands behind his back, and reads it slowly to himself, moving his lips. So that is the story, friends. That is the whole of it. A widow walked into a livestock market with $22 of tax bill hanging over her head and 1 Jersey cow on a soft rope, and a mountain man stood at the back of the yard and said, low and clear, 25. He paid cash. He led the cow away. He came back 3 days later with a wagon, and the wagon held a small herd and a winter's feed and a brand new Singer treadle machine, and a letter sealed in red wax that had been waiting 3 years for the right moment to be opened. He did not ask her to love him. He did not ask her to thank him. He did not even, in the end, ask her to accept. He simply unloaded the wagon, tipped his hat, and rode out, because a promise he had made at his wife's bedside in 1888 was, that morning, finally kept. She sold her last cow for $25, friends. She got it back with a sewing machine and a letter that built a future. Some kindnesses in this country are written in wills, and some wills in this country are kept. Good night, neighbors. Sleep easy. And if you ever stand at a market gate with the last warm thing in your life on a rope, may there always be, somewhere at the back of the yard, a quiet voice that says 25.